Hello everyone, Kurt Holfer here, and welcome back to another episode from Holfer Labs. Today we're going to be talking about a final section within the sword and armored portion of the manuscript. And it's not necessarily revolves to a play, but it has to deal with the equipment that Fiore is talking to and about within the section. Now I want to make this clear that essentially when we look at the plays of Fiore's Armazzari, there's a few things out there that I've noticed throughout the period of time that you don't see prevalent in this manuscript as you might find in other ones. And it is very, very much so an interest to me because I think it points to a notion of the aspects of the fight of the time. So a couple things right here. We're going to talk about the two types of swords that Fiore that he recommends at the end of the section, and also a commentary about the swords that he has within the section. So one thing that is very unique about Fiore's Armazzari to me is that while he does depict the usage of the sword being utilized as in a German context of the Mordschlag or Mordhau, he doesn't depict using a regular sword in that form and fashion. This right here is a significant thing to me because the reality is this whole portion of what's happening right here is he's talking about a specialty tool or weapon utilized for the practice of arms. Now, this could be, a variety of different reasons that are out there. I'm not saying that Fiore did not Mordschlag or anything like that as far as that's concerned. I just think it's an important thing to comment on because the two swords that he shows at the very end, they've kind of rolled by the screen here, he makes it very evident that there needs to be a spot where you can grab onto the blade. One of them looks like, the ability, it looks like an axe as much as it's a sword because it's got a rondelle that slides up and down, and it also has the ability to, have the point that's sharpened at the last 6 inches, which is a very interesting point to make in this. The other one is he has a handle, there's a portion right there that's carved out where this portion would grab onto, where the hand could be grabbed on. And it would not necessarily be in the other portions that are razor sharp. So that's a portion right here that I think is very important to note about these two specialty things. One of the things about this right here that it makes me think about is why we have these things and why Fiore doesn't just tell it to use a sword, as you see in other manuscript concepts of grabbing onto the blade and just striking somebody. Well, first and foremost, I have done training with a sharp sword as this, and one of the things I've recognized with this is that essentially the thing that is effective for this kind of use is the narrow properties of the blade. Now, for anyone that's seen any of my channel type stuff before, I'm a huge fan of what is depicted from Albion and other manufacturers like Arms and Armor of what is classified as a 15A, which is a very, very robust blade, but it's diamond profile and it's a little bit, and yes, it does have an edge. It just is also a little bit, diamond profile, so it's easy to be able to grab your hands around the full circumference of it and not just, the edge into the biting portions of your hand. That is I have used that in tests and whatnot, and there's other videos that show about those within the 6 dissimilar guards of me doing that with other swords that are very slender in the blade, which allowed for me to be able to use the handle, the cross guard, and the pommel as a striking aspect. When I look at other swords that I've utilized, like for example the Albion Principe or other ones that are broader as far as in the blade is concerned, those are ones that I actually would be very hesitant to grab midsection wise, as you would if you're talking about an axe grip, than one that is narrow profiled. The reason being for this is because, once again, like I've said, when you grab onto something, there's a space when you grab into it. It might just be the 2 points of your hand holding onto that because it gets very narrow in profile. With a 15A, as at least depicted by this, the diamond profile section, it's smaller, so when I wrap, I have more of my hand on holding that, which means I have a lot more control of that grip. Now again, mind you, I think grabbing a blade in general is a dangerous practice. We know Pedro Monte talks about putting chainmail inside of his gauntlets. along the leather portions of the leather portion of the gloves to be able to, it's to protect one's hands. Is this to be able to protect for the gripping of swords? Absolutely. Is it for other things in gripping somebody else's sword? Absolutely. As I've said before, in the beginning portions of like armor, chainmail to me is anti-laceration. It's anti-laceration and anti-cut. It's not anti-thrust. It's not anti-puncture or penetration. So to me, that makes a lot of sense why you'd have that on this spot right here so you can grab onto the sword. Fiore doesn't say anything about that in his manuscript, but I don't think that he would not have thought about these types of things. The question right here is instead of talking about specialty gauntlets, he optimizes two swords that are effectively a complete and total weapon system unto itself. So, not only is the blade and the tip, got an edge and sharp, it also has an edge, it has edges and spikes in the pommel. It also has an edge, and spikes along the crossguard. So everything on this thing is a defensive thing, but it is also an offensive thing. So if I get into utilizing the sword and I have my hand on the blade and my hand on the crossguard, punching forward with the crossguard is lethal because it's an edge. Much of the stuff that we have today when it comes down to, reproductions and, reproductions of reproductions, but also some of the training stuff that happens out there, many of them are rounded and they have different things in there that basically allow for certain functionalities to happen and to not happen. When I talk about things to happen, I'm talking about when you strike with these things, if they're rounded at the end, it's like a hammer where you have a point where a mass of weight can hit something. When it comes down to, turning the sword in crossings to be able to exchange thrusts and blows, it also allows for ways to lock the blade into position and protect yourself from being able to roll out of that. So you have these other these functions that are in there that allow us to work with it. For Fiore's armored sword section, the swords that we have here, it is a total weapon unto itself. And not that those nods at the end of the ones I said before that are not sharp in the crossguard aren't weapons in themselves. It's just to say that everything on this thing right here is designed to be sharp, spiky, and optimized for a variety of different actions. It's a specialty tool to me, which is another part right here that I think is very important to understand of this. And why would we have this? Is this a tool of war that we would see on the battlefield? I don't think so. Is this something that might be in the lists? That's more along the lines of where my head goes as far as to why he's got these two specialty swords at the very end. But enough of this as far as these two specialty swords, because the reality is he's not the only one that does this. But in his manuscript, which he talks about the two types of arbitari, dirty nasty tricks and courtly display, and he's talking about dirty nasty tricks, it makes a lot of sense to me that he has these optimized weapons, as we will see in other sections too, to cause great harm against something that is potentially, that you're crossed in. So the versatility of the sword in armor in itself, basically, how I see it for him is that he optimizes a variety of different uses on this right here. And if you remember the series of crossings that happen with the sword, the point and the forte really are the areas that control the sword. The mesospot is a crossing area. And if it goes in between there, which is another reason why I kind of wonder if that hand grip in the center, because if he crosses here, he can turn and control out still, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that he has lost his ability to do all other plays. Now with the axe grip sword, where the rondelle slides up and down, and it's more of a specialty weapon in itself. That in itself right there, to me, indicates that this might be something that, yes, you can strike with it, but it's more of an axe. It's more of a hybrid between all the weapon systems that he's got and not just a sword itself. So those are 2 points right there that I really want to talk about with these specialty items. But let's talk a second here about other portions within the manuscript where, he's using what appears just to be a standard grip sword, one that you would see anywhere within his plays. It could be that the person's hand is grabbing into the midsection, like he's talked about before, of the one type that's out there, as far as for half sorting. However, I tend to think here that, because of how he has depicted swords within the unarmored section, that he's also showing best practices for a sword if it is the standard one that we typically think about, which has got a blade that's full from forte to punta, and has got striking and cutting edges all the way through on that. The value of this right here of understanding is that it also makes us understand we have to think about what type of sword is in the hand of the beholder. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is a person out there that has a very narrow profiled sword. It could be that, in many ways right here, especially the gauntlets, along with other considerations that allow for other things to be enabled in that. But regardless of the fact here, if we talk about the sword of the 14th century, turn of the 15th century, in many cases, it does seem to me that there's a specialization of a standard sword being much more optimized for thrusting through the chainmail, being able to be optimized in different types of grips, and is a striker and not necessarily a cutter. So those are key points right there that I think are important to kind of bring about when it comes to the discussion of the swords and armor and Fiore's armor and Fiore's swords just in general. This is not anything new to anybody out there as far as this goes, but I recently had a conversation in one of my classes, and I asked people, what sword do you have in your hand? That's a big dictating factor about what you actually do with it. If it's one that's, like I said before, the Albion Principe, that's got a huge blade, and I can't get my fingers around that, that is one I'm probably not going to grab in a half sword consideration. It's probably something right that I'm going to use as the optimization of the blade, if it ever was used at all in regards to combat. We don't know, right? But if it's one that's supposed to be versatile, then that means it's going to be somewhere in between as far as for grip, which is probably indicative of the wielder, and not just like a standardization of equipment that's out there that you see later on in regimented armies. So the sword that we see here within the sword in one hand, two hand, and an armored section, to me is all the same sword except for the two specialty ones at the very end. And that's an important note right here, because Fiore, in this case here, while he does endanger one of his hands in regards to working with it and grappling and whatnot, it's never without a consideration for what he actually has. So the sword of the period of time is probably something that's a lot more narrow in profile tip, right? That allows for that type of gripping to happen. One thing that he does not do, as you see within the German text, is grab onto the blade with both hands, like you see, like I said, once again, the Mordschlag or the Mordhau. Instead, he has specialty weapons there. I don't know if this has ever been talked about, and this might seem kind of common sense to some people, but it isn't to me. I had to think about this a long time, and as I gather my thoughts about this discussion here, it makes me think about how the combat professional probably had specialty devices that we may not even have, history or record of, used to optimize certain actions that would normally endanger a user in the event of it. The image we see within Talhofer where a guy's using a Mordschlag against somebody who's in armor. To me, that's a message of a very desperate situation, because the person's unarmored against someone who's armored. The person who's unarmored, well, certainly not without, who's not necessarily, they're not easily defeated. They have much going against them because they are open up. Anything, one strike will, you think about the principalities of what Fiore talks about. One strike or misparry equals death. And in this case right here, that makes a lot of sense that he turns around, because the blade, for effective, for all intents and purposes, is pretty much useless against the amount of armor that one combatant is wearing. But with that being the case here, why, so he's risking his hands to protect his body. In Fiore's Armazzari, you don't really see that. And that tells me that the combat professional, there's no reason to do it, and that the thrusting or using the sword as ways to be able to make someone's ears ring as you clock them in the helmet, or strike them to get other spots into grappling considerations, has of greater use, and therefore must be versatile, which means it has to be slender, and therefore for the purpose of usage of dealing with that kind of close quarter combat that we see within the armored sections. So that's really going to do it for this video here. Again, this is not anything new. I'm curious what people think of this. I want this to be more of a discussion for people to think about and to talk and share, because a lot of times, when I'm starting to use stuff that's out there, as far as for swords are concerned, it's not always, evident to me like what you have in your hand. And as somebody who has done, Mordschlag or axe grip, usage of the sword against some of my striking, experiments, and experience, have been nicked and whatnot in that spot, or even think about receiving certain blows. It makes me think about what these images are showing, and the hand protection, which Petromonti talks about, but also the equipment itself. So let me know what your thoughts are on this right here. Leave a comment below and share this with a friend out there. Like, subscribe, and pass this along, because we want to grow this channel here, and I want to have these kind of conversations grow and blossom, because I do think that they are very important facets of the martial arts. So with that being the case, everybody, as always, please, until I see you, stay safe out there, train well, and fight on. I'll see you all soon.